Elena had been cleaning the Hartwell Concert Hall for 12 years. Every single night, she walked through those grand doors with her mop and bucket, ready to scrub floors that thousands of feet had walked on just hours before. She knew every corner of that building. She knew which seats creaked when you sat down. She knew where the dust liked to hide behind the velvet curtains. And most of all, she knew the piano dot. It sat in the center of the stage like a king on his throne. A beautiful black grand piano that gleamed under the soft lights even when the hall was empty. Elena had polished that piano more times than she could count. She would run her cloth across its surface slowly, carefully, like she was touching something sacred. And sometimes, when she was sure nobody was watching, she would let her fingers hover just above the keys. She never pressed them. She never dared. But she would close her eyes and imagine the music that could come from those keys. If only she had the courage to play. Nobody at the concert hall knew anything about Elena's past. To them, she was just the quiet cleaning lady who came in after the shows and left before the morning. She never talked much. She always smiled politely when someone passed by, but she kept to herself. That was how she liked it. That was how it had to be. Elena was 63 years old now. Her hands were rough from years of hard work. Her back ached when she bent down too long. But her eyes still had a spark in them, especially when she looked at that piano. It reminded her of another time, another life, one that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. One evening in late November, something different happened. The concert hall was hosting a big charity event, one of those fancy gatherings where rich people came dressed inexpensive, clothes to eat tiny food and feel good about donating money. Elena had been asked to come in early that night to help serve drinks before the main performance. It was not her usual job, but they were short on staff, and her supervisor had promised her extra pay dot. She put on a simple black dress that she saved for special occasions and tied her gray hair back neatly. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked tired. She looked old. But she straightened her shoulders and told herself it was just one night. The guests started arriving around 7. Elena stood near the entrance with a tray of champagne glasses, watching as they floated in one by one. The women wore long gowns that sparkled under the chandeliers. The men wore suits that probably cost more than Elena made in a year. They laughed loudly and kissed each other on both cheeks like they were all old friends. Maybe they were. Elena would never know. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, offering drinks and nodding politely when someone took a glass without even looking at her. That was fine. She was used to being invisible. In fact, she preferred it. As the evening went on, Elena heard whispers spreading through the crowd. Everyone was talking about the guest of honor, a man named Victor Ashford. She had heard that name before. He was a world-famous pianist, someone who had performed in the greatest concert halls across the globe. People called him a genius. They said his fingers could make a piano sing in ways that brought audiences to tears. Elena had never seen him perform in person, but she had heard recordings of his music late at night while cleaning the hall. The staff sometimes played classical music through the speakers while they worked, and more than once she had stopped mopping just to listen. His playing was beautiful. There was no denying that. But there was something cold about it, too. Something technical and perfect, but missing a certain warmth. When Victor finally walked into the hall, the crowd parted for him like water making way for a ship. He was tall and thin, with silver hair slicked back, and a face that looked like it had never smiled a day in its life. He wore a black suit with a red pocket square, and he carried himself like he knew everyone in the room was watching him. Because they were. Elena watched him from across the room as he shook hands with important-looking people and accepted compliments with a small nod of his head. He never said thank you. He just nodded, like he already knew he was great and did not need anyone to tell him. She tried to stay out of his way. Men like Victor Ashford did not notice women like her, and that was perfectly fine. But fate had other plans, Dot. It happened near the end of the cocktail hour. Elena was carrying a fresh tray of drinks across the floor when someone bumped into her from behind. She stumbled forward, and the glasses wobbled dangerously on the tray. She managed to steady herself just in time, but not before one glass tipped over and splashed a few drops of champagne onto someone's sleeve. That someone was Victor Ashford. Elena's heart stopped. She looked up and saw his cold gray eyes staring down at her with a mixture of annoyance and disgust. Her hands began to shake. "I am so sorry, sir," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "Please forgive me. I did not see you there. I am so sorry." Victor looked at the wet spot on his sleeve, then looked back at her. He did not say anything for a long moment. He just studied her face, like she was some kind of insect that had crawled onto his shoe. "Watch where you are going," he said finally, his voice low and sharp. "This suit costs more than you probably make in 6 months." Elena felt her face burn with shame. She wanted to disappear into the floor. She wanted to run out of the building and never come back. But she just stood there, frozen, clutching her tray with white knuckles. "I am sorry," she whispered again. Victor waved his hand dismissively and turned away, already forgetting she existed. A woman nearby handed him a napkin, and he dabbed at his sleeve while making a joke that Elena could not hear. The people around him laughed, and just like that, the moment was over. But for Elena, it was not over. She walked to the corner of the room and set her tray down on a table because her hands were shaking too much to carry it. She felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had survived worse things in her life than a rude comment from a rich man. Much worse. She took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was here. It was just a job. It was just one night. Soon the guests would move into the main hall for the performance, and she could fade back into the shadows where she belonged. But as she stood there trying to calm her racing heart, she could not help but glance at the stage. The grand piano was waiting there, silent and beautiful under the soft lights. And for just a moment, Elena let herself remember what it felt like to sit at a piano like that. What it felt like to let her fingers fly across the keys. What it felt like to make music that came from somewhere deep inside her soul. That was a long time ago, she told herself. That woman is gone, but deep down, in a place she had tried very hard to bury, that woman was still there. Still waiting. Still hoping Dot, and tonight, against all odds, she was about to get her chance. The guests slowly made their way from the reception area into the main concert hall. Elena watched them go, feeling a strange mix of relief and longing. Relief because she could finally step back into the shadows. Longing because she knew what was about to happen on that stage. And part of her wished she could sit in one of those velvet seats and just listen. But that was not her place. Her place was in the back, near the service door, where the staff stood waiting in case anyone needed anything. She found a spot against the wall and folded her hands in front of her, trying to make herself as small as possible. The lights in the hall dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. A spotlight appeared on the stage, and it was Victor Ashford, walking toward the grand piano with the confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. The audience clapped politely as he took his seat on the bench. He did not acknowledge them. He simply adjusted his coat, placed his fingers on the keys, and began to play. The first notes filled the room, like water filling a glass. Smooth, perfect, controlled. Victor played a piece by Chopin, one that Elena knew by heart. She had played it herself many times, back when playing was still part of her life. Back when music was everything to her, She closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. His technique was flawless. Every note was exactly where it should be. His timing was precise, his touch was clean, and his fingers moved across the keys like they were born to do nothing else. The audience sat in complete silence, captivated by his skill. But as Elena listened, she felt something missing. The notes were all there, but the soul was not. It was like looking at a beautiful painting and realizing it had no heart. Victor played the music, but he did not feel it. He performed it like a job, not like a passion. And somehow, that made Elena sad. When the first piece ended, the audience erupted in applause. Victor stood and gave a small bow, accepting the praise like it was his birthright. Then he sat back down and began another piece, this one faster and more complicated. His fingers flew across the keys, showing off his speed and precision. The crowd gasped at his skill. A few people whispered to each other in amazement. Elena stayed frozen against the wall, her eyes fixed on the piano. Memories flooded her mind. She remembered the first time she ever touched a piano, when she was just 5 years old. She remembered her teacher, a kind old woman with gentle hands, who told her she had a gift. She remembered the long hours of practice, the competitions, the applause. She remembered what it felt like to sit on that bench and pour her entire heart into the music. And then she remembered the day it all ended. A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, hoping no one had noticed. But someone had. Victor finished his second piece and stood again to accept the applause. As he turned to acknowledge the audience, his eyes swept across the room and landed on Elena. She was standing in the shadows near the back, but the dim light caught the wetness on her face. She was crying. Something flickered in Victor's expression. It was not sympathy. It was not kindness. It was amusement. Here was this simple woman, this nobody in a plain black dress, moved to tears by his greatness. It was almost funny to him, almost pathetic. He raised a hand, and the applause died down. The audience waited, expecting him to announce his next piece. But instead, Victor pointed directly at Elena. "You there," he called out, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "The woman in the back. Come forward." Elena's heart stopped. Every head in the room turned to look at her. She felt the blood drain from her face. This could not be happening. He could not be talking to her, but he was. "Yes, you," Victor continued, a thin smile playing on his lips. "I saw you crying. My music moved you that much, did it? I am flattered." A few people in the audience chuckled. Elena wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. But her feet would not move. Victor gestured toward the stage. "Why don't you come up here? Since you appreciate music so deeply, perhaps you would like to share your own talent with us." The laughter grew louder now. People were turning in their seats to get a better look at the poor cleaning woman who had been singled out by the great Victor Ashford. Some of them looked uncomfortable, but most of them seemed entertained. This was unexpected. This was fun. A little joke to break up the evening. I cannot," Elena managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not play." "You do not play?" Victor repeated, raising his eyebrows in mock surprise. "Then what were you crying about? Were my skills so overwhelming that they reduced you to tears?" More laughter. Elena's cheeks burned with humiliation. She shook her head and looked down at the floor, wishing she could be anywhere else in the world. But Victor was not finished. He was enjoying this too much to stop now. "Come now, do not be shy," he said, his tone dripping with fake kindness. "Everyone has a little music in them, even someone like you. Surely you can play something. A simple tune, perhaps? Mary had a little lamb? Twinkle, twinkle, little star? The audience laughed again, louder this time. A woman in the front row covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hide her giggles. A man near the middle shook his head, grinning at the spectacle. Elena stood paralyzed. Her mind was screaming at her to run, to get out of there before this got any worse. But something else was happening inside her too. Something she had not felt in a very long time. It was anger. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger. It was something quieter, something deeper. It was the anger of a woman who had spent her whole life being overlooked and underestimated. The anger of someone who had given up everything she loved and never complained. The anger of a person who had been invisible for so long that she had almost forgotten she existed. And now this man, this arrogant, heartless man, was using her as a joke. He was making fun of her in front of hundreds of people just because he could. Just because she was nobody to him. Just because her hands were rough and her dress was plain and she cleaned floors for a living. Elena looked up. Her eyes met Victor's across the room. And in that moment, something shifted. "Very well," she said softly. The laughter died down. People looked confused. Did she just say yes? Victor blinked, clearly surprised. He had expected her to run away in tears. He had not expected her to accept. "I am sorry. What did you say?" he asked. Elena took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her legs were trembling, but she took a step forward anyway. "I said very well," she repeated, louder this time. "I will play." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Victor's smile faltered for just a second before he recovered. "Wonderful," he said, clapping his hands together. "This should be entertaining. Please, come up. The stage is yours." Elena walked forward. Each step felt like a mile. The audience watched in curious silence as this small, gray-haired woman in a simple black dress made her way down the aisle toward the stage. Some people whispered to each other. A few looked sympathetic. Most just looked amused, waiting to see what would happen next. When she reached the stage, Victor stepped aside with a dramatic flourish and gestured toward the piano bench. "Please," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Show us what you can do." Elena climbed the steps to the stage. The spotlight was blinding. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, waiting, judging, expecting her to fail. Her hands were shaking as she approached the piano. She stood there for a moment, looking down at the keys. They gleamed under the lights, black and white, familiar and terrifying all at once. She had not played in over 30 years. She had told herself that chapter of her life was closed forever. But here she was. She sat down on the bench. The wood was cool beneath her. She placed her fingers on the keys, and the touch sent a shiver down her spine. It felt like coming home after a very long journey. The room was completely silent. Everyone was watching. Waiting. Victor stood off to the side with his arms crossed, a smug smile on his face. He was already imagining the clumsy notes, the embarrassed apology, the quick exit. This was going to be the highlight of his evening. Elena closed her eyes. She took one last breath, and then she began to play. The first note rang out into the silence, like a single drop of rain before a storm. It was soft, almost hesitant, like someone whispering a secret they had kept hidden for too long. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats, ready to cringe at whatever clumsy melody was about to follow. Victor's smug smile widened. This was going to be even more embarrassing than he had imagined. But then came the second note, and the third. And suddenly, the hesitation was gone. Elena's fingers began to move across the keys with a grace that no one in that room had expected. The music poured out of her like water breaking through a dam. It was Chopin's ballade? No. one of the most difficult and beautiful pieces ever written for piano. The same composer Victor had played just minutes before. But this was different. This was something else entirely. The audience went completely still. The smiles faded from their faces. The whispers stopped. Even the air in the room seemed to hold its breath. Elena played with her eyes closed, her body swaying gently with the music. Her rough, work-worn hands moved across the keys, like they had never stopped playing, like the 30 years of silence had been nothing more than a pause between movements. Every note was perfect. Every phrase was filled with emotion so deep and so raw that it seemed to reach inside the hearts of everyone listening and squeeze. Woman in the third row felt tears spring to her eyes without understanding why. A man near the back leaned forward in his seat, his mouth slightly open, completely hypnotized. An elderly couple held hands without looking at each other, both of them lost in the music. This was not just playing. This was storytelling. This was a lifetime of joy and sorrow, and loss and hope, all woven together into something so beautiful it almost hurt to hear. Victor's smile disappeared. His arms dropped to his sides. He stood frozen at the edge of the stage, watching this woman he had mocked just moments ago create music that he could never hope to match. His technique was flawless, yes. His training was impeccable. But Elena had something he did not have and could never buy or learn. She had soul. The piece built slowly, moving through moments of gentle tenderness into passages of fierce intensity. Elena's fingers flew across the keys during the fast sections, hitting every note with precision and passion. During the slow sections, she lingered on each phrase, letting the notes hang in the air like echoes of a memory. The piano seemed to come alive under her touch, singing and crying and laughing all at once. People in the audience began to cry openly. They did not even try to hide it. There was something about the music that broke down all the walls they had built around their hearts. It reminded them of things they had lost, people they had loved, dreams they had given up on. The music spoke to something deep inside them, something they had forgotten was even there, that Elena was no longer aware of the audience. She was no longer aware of Victor, or the spotlight, or the hundreds of eyes watching her. She was somewhere else entirely. She was back in Moscow, a young girl sitting at her teacher's piano, discovering for the first time that her fingers could create magic. She was at her first competition, trembling with nerves, but playing through it anyway. She was in the small apartment where her father lay sick, playing softly by his bedside because music was the only comfort she could give him. She was everywhere she had ever been, and she was nowhere at all. She was just the music. Nothing more. Nothing less. The piece reached its final movement, building toward a climax that seemed to shake the very walls of the concert hall. Elena's hands crashed down on the keys with a power that no one would have thought possible from such a small, quiet woman. The music swelled and soared, filling every corner of the room, wrapping around every person like an embrace. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The last note faded into silence. Elena's hands rested on the keys for a moment, trembling slightly. Her eyes were still closed. Her chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. For a few seconds, she had forgotten where she was. She had forgotten everything except the music. Then she opened her eyes. The silence in the hall was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. Elena looked out at the sea of faces staring back at her. She saw tears streaming down cheeks. She saw mouths hanging open in disbelief. She saw expressions of shock and wonder, and something that looked almost like reverence. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the audience, someone began to clap. It was slow at first. Just one pair of hands. Then another joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted in applause, so loud and so fierce that it seemed to shake the chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. People rose to their feet. One row, then another, then the entire audience, standing and clapping and cheering like they had just witnessed something miraculous. Because they had, Elena sat on the piano bench, overwhelmed. She did not know what to do. She had not expected this. She had not expected any of this. She had just wanted to prove, maybe to herself more than anyone else, that she was not nothing. That she was not just a cleaning lady to be laughed at. That there was still something inside her worth knowing. The applause went on and on. It did not stop. People were shouting now, calling out words she could not quite hear over the noise. Some of them were crying and clapping at the same time. A few had their hands pressed to their hearts, like they were trying to hold in something that wanted to burst out. Victor had not moved. He stood at the edge of the stage like a statue, his face pale and his eyes wide. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world turn upside down. Everything he believed about himself, about his talent, about his place at the top of the musical world, had been shattered in the span of 10 minutes by a woman he had dismissed as beneath him. He did not clap. He could not. His hands hung limp at his sides, and his mouth opened and closed without making a sound. For the first time in his life, Victor Ashford had nothing to say. Elena finally stood up from the bench. Her legs were shaky, and she had to hold onto the piano for support. She looked out at the standing crowd, at the tear-streaked faces and the raised hands, and she felt something she had not felt in a very, very long time. She felt seen. Not as a cleaning lady, not as a nobody, not as someone to be pitied or ignored or mocked. She felt seen as herself, as the woman she had always been underneath all those years of hard work and sacrifice and silence. She gave a small bow, just a slight nod of her head, and the applause somehow grew even louder. People were stamping their feet now, calling for more. They did not want this moment to end. They wanted to stay inside the magic she had created for as long as possible, but Elena knew it was over. She had said what she needed to say. The music had spoken for her, telling the story she had kept locked away for 30 years. There was nothing more to add. She walked slowly toward the edge of the stage, and the crowd parted for her like she was royalty. Hands reached out to touch her arm, to shake her hand, to offer congratulations. Voices called out to her, asking who she was, where she had come from, why they had never heard of her before. She did not answer. She just smiled softly and kept walking, her head held high for the first time in longer than she could remember. Behind her, Victor still had not moved. He watched her go, and something in his expression shifted. The arrogance was gone. The superiority was gone. What remained was something much more complicated, something that looked almost like shame. He had tried to humiliate her. He had used her as a joke to entertain his wealthy audience. And instead, she had shown him and everyone else in that room what real music sounded like. Elena reached the back of the hall and slipped through the service door, disappearing into the quiet corridor beyond. The applause was still ringing in her ears. Her heart was still pounding in her chest. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know if this moment would change anything, or if tomorrow she would be back to mopping floors and polishing pianos she never played. But right now, in this moment, none of that mattered, because for 10 glorious minutes, she had been exactly who she was always meant to be, and no one could ever take that away from her. The applause continued even after Elena had disappeared through the service door. People were still on their feet, still clapping, still wiping tears from their eyes. The energy in the room was electric, like something had shifted in the air. And everyone could feel it, but no one could quite explain it. Victor remained frozen at the edge of the stage. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. He had performed on stages all over the world. He had played for presidents and kings. He had received standing ovations in the most prestigious concert halls on earth. But he had never, not once in his entire career, seen an audience react the way they had reacted to that woman. That cleaning woman. He felt a knot forming in his stomach. It was an unfamiliar feeling, something he had not experienced in a very long time. It took him a moment to recognize it for what it was. Shame got the applause, finally began to fade, but the buzz of conversation that replaced it was even louder. Everyone was talking at once. Who was she? Where did she learn to play like that? How? Was this possible? The questions flew through the crowd like sparks from a fire. Near the front of the hall, an elderly woman with white hair and pearl earrings slowly rose from her seat. Her name was Dorothy Chun, and she was the host of the charity gala. At 82 years old, she had spent her entire life in the world of classical music. She had been a professor at one of the most famous music conservatories in America. She had taught some of the greatest pianists of the last 50 years. She had heard thousands of performances in her lifetime, but she had never heard anything quite like what she had just witnessed. Her hands were trembling as she made her way toward the stage, not from age or weakness, but from shock, because she had recognized something in that woman's playing, something that had stirred a memory buried deep in her mind, a memory from over 30 years ago. She climbed the steps to the stage, moving past Victor without even looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the service door where Elena had exited. She stood there for a moment, her mind working, trying to put the pieces together. Then she turned to face the audience. "Please," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Please, everyone. May I have your attention?" The room gradually fell silent. People looked up at the frail woman standing alone on the stage, wondering what she was going to say. Dorothy took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding in a way it had not pounded in years. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "Something that I think you all deserve to know. That woman who just played for us, the woman you were laughing at just minutes ago, she is not who you think she is." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Victor turned to look at Dorothy, a confused expression on his face. 35 years ago, Dorothy continued, I attended a music competition in Moscow. It was one of the most prestigious competitions in the world at that time. Pianists came from every corner of the globe to compete. I was there as a judge. She paused, her eyes glistening with tears. There was a young woman in that competition. She was only 22 years old, but she played with a maturity and depth that I had never seen in someone so young. She did not just play the notes. She lived inside the music. She made the piano speak in a way that left the entire audience speechless. I remember sitting in my chair, tears streaming down my face, thinking that I was witnessing the birth of one of the greatest pianists of our generation. The room was completely silent now. Everyone was hanging on her every word. Her name was Elena Volkov, Dorothy said softly. And she won that competition. She did not just win it. She dominated it. Every judge gave her the highest marks. Every person in that audience knew they had seen something extraordinary. The music world was ready to welcome her with open arms. She was going to be a star. Victor felt his blood run cold. He stared at Dorothy, unable to believe what he was hearing. But then, Dorothy continued, her voice growing heavy with sadness, everything changed. The Soviet Union was collapsing. Elena's family lost everything they had. Her father became very ill, and there was no money for treatment. Elena had a choice to make. She could pursue her career, travel the world, become the famous pianist everyone expected her to be. Or she could stay home and take care of her father. Dorothy paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. She chose her father. She gave up everything, her dreams, her future, her music. She worked whatever job she could find to pay for his medicine and keep a roof over their heads. Eventually, she immigrated to America with nothing but a small suitcase and a broken heart. She never played publicly again. She disappeared from the music world completely. I always wondered what happened to her. I always hoped she had found happiness somewhere. Dorothy looked toward the service door, her eyes filled with tears. And now I know. She has been here all along, cleaning floors, polishing the very piano she should have been playing, invisible to everyone who walked past her every single day. The silence in the room was deafening. People looked at each other with expressions of shock and guilt. Some of them covered their mouths with their hands. Others bowed their heads in shame. They had laughed at her. They had watched Victor mock her, and they had laughed. Victor felt like the floor was crumbling beneath his feet. His face had gone completely white. His hands were shaking. He looked out at the audience, at the judgment in their eyes, and for the first time in his life, he had no clever words to defend himself. He had humiliated a woman who had sacrificed everything for love. He had made a joke out of someone whose talent made his own look small and ordinary. He had stood on that stage, so full of pride and arrogance, and he had tried to crush a person who had already been through more pain than he could ever imagine. And the worst part was, he had done it for entertainment, for a laugh, for a moment of cruel fun. A woman in the audience stood up. "We need to find her," she said, her voice urgent. "We need to tell her how sorry we are." Others nodded in agreement. People began rising from their seats, looking toward the exits, wondering where Elena had gone, but Dorothy raised her hand to stop them. "Give her a moment," she said gently. "She has carried this burden alone for 30 years. She just shared a piece of her soul with all of us. The least we can do is give her the space to breathe." The crowd settled back down, but the energy in the room had completely changed. The glamorous gala had been forgotten. The champagne sat untouched on the tables. The fancy dresses and expensive suits seemed meaningless now. All anyone could think about was the quiet woman in the plain black dress who had just turned their entire world upside down. Victor slowly walked off the stage. He did not say a word to anyone. He moved through the crowd like a ghost, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of anyone around him. People stepped aside to let him pass, but no one reached out to shake his hand. No one offered a word of praise. He found a quiet corner near the back of the hall and stood there alone, his mind replaying the events of the evening over and over again. He saw himself pointing at Elena, calling her up to the stage. He heard his own voice, dripping with sarcasm, asking her to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. He remembered the laughter, the smug smile on his face, the certainty that he was superior to her in every way. And then he remembered the music, the way she had played, the way the audience had wept, the way he had felt standing there on the stage, realizing that everything he believed about himself was a lie. He was not the greatest pianist in the room that night. He was not even close. Victor closed his eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. He did not know what to do next. He did not know how to fix what he had broken. All he knew was that something inside him had changed, and there was no going back. Somewhere in the building, Elena was sitting alone in a quiet hallway, unaware that her story was spreading through the crowd like wildfire. She did not know that people were crying for her. She did not know that her name was being spoken with reverence and awe. She did not know that the life she had hidden for so long was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. All she knew was that she had played the piano again, and for now, that was enough. Elena woke up the next morning in her small apartment, the same way she had woken up every morning for the past 12 years. The sun came through the thin curtains. The coffee maker gurgled on the kitchen counter. Everything looked exactly the same as it always did, But everything had changed. She lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the night before had been real. Part of her still could not believe it. She had played the piano. After 30 years of silence, she had sat down on that stage and played. And people had listened. People had cried. People had stood on their feet and clapped like she was someone important. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. She finally picked it up and saw dozens of missed calls and messages from numbers she did not recognize. Her heart began to race. She opened one of the messages. It was from a woman who said she worked at a news station. She wanted to interview Elena about what happened at the gala. Another message was from a man who claimed to be a music producer. He said he had seen a video of her performance and wanted to talk about recording opportunities. There were messages from journalists, concert organizers, and complete strangers who just wanted to tell her how much her playing had moved them. Elena sat up in bed, her hands trembling. A video. Someone had recorded her performance and shared it online. She opened her laptop and searched her name. What she found made her gasp. The video was everywhere. It had been shared thousands of times overnight. The title read something like "Cleaning Lady Stuns Arrogant Pianist," with incredible performance, and it already had millions of views. The comments section was flooded with messages of support and admiration. People were calling her a hero. They were calling her an inspiration. They were sharing her story with friends and family all over the world. Elena closed the laptop and pressed her hands to her face. This was too much. This was all too much. She had spent 30 years trying to be invisible, and now suddenly the whole world was looking at her dot. There was a knock at her door. She froze. The knocking came again, gentle but persistent. Elena got up slowly and walked to the door. She looked through the peephole and felt her breath catch in her throat. It was Victor Ashford. He looked different than he had the night before. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His silver hair was messy. His eyes were red and tired, like he had not slept at all. He stood in the hallway with his shoulders slumped, holding something in his hands. Elena did not know what to do. Part of her wanted to leave him standing there. Part of her wanted to scream at him for what he had done. But there was another part of her, a quieter part, that recognized something in his expression. Something broken. Something lost. She opened the door. Victor looked up at her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither one knew how to cross. Finally, Victor cleared his throat. "I do not expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice hoarse. "I would not forgive me either. What I did last night was cruel and unforgivable. I humiliated you in front of hundreds of people because I thought it would be funny, because I thought I was better than you, because I am a small, arrogant man who never learned how to see the worth in anyone but himself." He paused, his hands tightening around the envelope he was holding. "I have spent my whole life believing that talent was everything, that being the best was all that mattered. I worked harder than anyone I knew. I practiced until my fingers bled. I sacrificed friendships and relationships and everything else because I was so desperate to be great. And for a while, I thought I had succeeded." He shook his head slowly. "But last night, I realized the truth. I am not great. I am not even close. You played for 10 minutes, and you made every person in that room feel something they will never forget. I have been playing for 40 years, and I have never done that. Not once." Elena watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. "I did not come here to make excuses," Victor continued. "There are no excuses for what I did. I came here because I want to do something. I want to try, in some small way, to make things right." He held out the envelope. "This is a contract," he said. An invitation to perform at Lincoln Center, one of the biggest stages in the world. I have connections there. I made some calls this morning. They want you, Elena. They want you to perform a full concert solo in front of thousands of people. All expenses paid, and every penny from ticket sales will go to a charity of your choosing. Elena stared at the envelope, but did not take it. I am also going to step away from performing for a while, Victor added quietly. I need time to think, to figure out who I am without the applause and the fame. Maybe I will come back someday. Maybe I will not. But either way, I need to learn how to be a better person. And that starts with admitting that I was wrong. He lowered his hand, still holding the envelope. You do not have to accept this, he said. You do not owe me anything, but I hope you will consider it. Not for me, for yourself, for all the years you spent in silence, for the gift you have that deserves to be shared with the world. Elena stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the man who had tried to destroy her just hours before. She saw the shame in his eyes. She saw the sincerity in his voice. She saw a person who had been forced to look in the mirror and did not like what he found. She reached out and took the envelope. Victor let out a breath. He did not know he had been holding. Thank you, he whispered. Elena nodded slowly. I am not doing this for you, she said, her voice calm and steady. I am doing this for the little girl who fell in love with music when she was 5 years old. I am doing this for my father, who always believed I would play again someday. And I am doing this for every person out there who has been told they are not good enough, who has been laughed at and looked down on and made to feel small. She looked Victor directly in the eyes. I forgive you, she said, not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger is too heavy, and I have carried enough weight in my life. Victor's eyes filled with tears. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He simply nodded, turned, and walked away down the hallway. Elena closed the door and leaned against it, the envelope pressed to her chest. Her heart was pounding. Her mind was spinning. But underneath all the chaos, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. 3 months later, Elena Volkov walked onto the stage at Lincoln Center. The concert hall was packed. Every seat was filled. People had come from all over the country to see her, the cleaning lady who had shocked the world. She wore a simple black dress, the same one she had worn that night at the gala. Her gray hair was pulled back neatly. Her hands, still rough from years of hard work, rested gently on her lap as she sat down at the grand piano. The audience fell silent. Elena looked out at the sea of faces. She saw young people and old people. She saw musicians and music lovers. She saw strangers who had become fans and friends who had supported her through everything. And somewhere in the back, standing alone in the shadows, she saw Victor Ashford. He had come to watch, not to perform, not to be seen, just to listen. Elena smiled softly. Then she placed her fingers on the keys, closed her eyes, and began to play. The music filled the hall, rising up to the highest balconies and reaching into the deepest corners of every heart. It was the sound of a dream that had been delayed but never destroyed. It was the sound of a woman who had lost everything and found herself again. It was the sound of a second chance. And this time, the whole world was listening.